Well, hello, everyone. Greetings. We're very happy to be here with you for our hometown crowd final book tour event. It's been our book tour has been going since January, which is kind of wild. But I'm Nick Brown-Cáceres. I'm the chief of the music division and one of the co-authors of Let the People Hear It, Concerts from the Library of Congress at 100. And this is
David Plylar. I'm in the concert office, one of the concert producers. And happy to be here.
Woo! So, how many of you have been here before? Well, might as well. How many of you have been coming here since before 1960 for events? Yeah, Ben. Anyone pre-1960 in the room? How about pre-1970? Handful of you. Thank you. Pre-1980. Okay. Pre-1990. Pre-2000. Okay. Right. Pre-2010. Pre-2020. Newbies since the pandemic. Yeah, good. Welcome. Well, as those of you who have been coming for many years know that while we have this privilege of being part of something that is bigger than all of us, that is done on behalf of the people of the United States, which is kind of crazy and shocking to think of in that way. It is, at the end of the day, a community, and you are all members of that community, whether you've been coming for 50 plus years or this is your first day. And we're really proud of the fact that since 1925, on October 28th, that community has been thriving no matter what has been thrown in front of us or rained down on Christmas Eve 2022. Yeah, that's right. And so on and so forth. But it's been quite a journey over 100 years to get to this moment. And we're really excited to share some of the stories behind the history of the concert series with you, and particularly the stories of the people who created this journey for us. For those of you who are groupies, who are either related to David or to myself, you've heard this talk several times, but we think tonight's going to be a little different flavor. So we're going to respond to what you give us in the room. And Bruce is not allowed to heckle wherever Bruce is. But anyways, we're going to start at the beginning with the tale of Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge. And rather than... Well, I'll tell you a little bit first, and then we'll give you an audio clip. Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge was raised in Chicago. She was a pianist. She, in fact, soloed with the Chicago Symphony early on in her life. Her father was a big supporter of the arts and culture in Chicago, and he worked in industry. The family was hugely supportive of the Chicago Symphony in its early days. Her father was on the board. And she eventually ended up making the first contribution to the Chicago Symphony Pension Fund, which was pretty groundbreaking in the world of orchestras back in the day. But Mrs. Coolidge comes into the story of the Library of Congress in her middle age. And in 1923, something very cool happened. One of our colleague predecessors, Carl Engel, who was the chief of the music division in that period of the 1920s, went up to the South Mountain Concerts, which Mrs. Coolidge had sponsored in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where she built a concert hall, one of 4 concert halls she would build over the course of her life. And Engel wanted to go see her because he heard about what she did with commissioning living composers and asking them for their manuscript. He wanted to go up there to get the manuscripts, basically, to convince her that giving the manuscripts to the Library of Congress was going to be a meaningful way to expand her impact and legacy and help us build the collections at the Library of Congress in a moment when the Librarian of Congress, Herbert Putnam, was really interested in growing the library's holdings so that it would be a global superpower national library, which was very much accomplished and continues to be accomplished to this day. So Engel and Mrs. Coolidge get along very well from the outset. And by early 1924, they had convinced Herbert Putnam that there was a need to do some concerts. Herbert Putnam was not so for this idea, one can say. If anyone's worked in the government or interacted with the government, there's a very certain diplomatic, charming way of saying no to someone, which is, oh, we would love to do that, but we just don't present concerts at the Library of Congress, which was literally what was being said back to her. But thankfully, she and Engel had teamed up, and they knew how to operate in this environment of diplomacy, and would not take no for an answer. Got the blessing to do a test run of concerts at the brand new Freer Gallery of Arts auditorium, which many of you might have heard concerts in over the years. musicians from Marlborough, for example, who have also come and perform on our series when that hall or that museum was under renovation. So 1924, in February, there were test concerts. What do you do when you're trying to make a splash in Washington? You invite important people to the events, and you get their buy-in, and you get them to send you thank you notes where you say, oh, how wonderful it was, this and that. The First Lady was invited, major ambassadors from European countries and elsewhere, music critics from all up and down the Northeast came to these concerts, and it was a smashing success. Members of Congress were writing to the library saying, this was amazing, I want more. We love that, right? We work for Congress. So what ended up happening was this was the proof of concept that then Mrs. Coolidge and Engel on these concerts could then go back to Putnam and say, hey, it worked and it made the library look really good. So let's stop with the fussing and let's figure out a way to present concerts at the Library of Congress. And truly, at this point in time, the library was not presenting programs in any way that we do today, principally because there was no private money coming into the library at this time. Philanthropy was not a part of our institution's mandate at that point. So the discussions continue. Herbert Putnam says, oh, well, lovely idea. It went really great. However, we don't have a concert hall. So ta-da, it's over. Guess what? Mrs. Coolidge does not accept no for an answer and is a genius in the art of negotiation and said, no problem. I'm going to go to my friends in Congress who just had a great time at the concerts, and I'm going to get them to support this idea. And guess what, Mr. Putnam? Then it's in your interest to support this idea, and I'll pay for it. Oh, well, that would be lovely, so kind of you. However, we're not legally allowed to accept your money, so there it is. Okay, well, let's go back to Congress and let's get legislation passed to have the mechanism put in place for the library to accept private funds to build the concert hall next door, and also to establish endowments at the library, starting with Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge's foundation, which was the first endowment. Mrs. Coolidge was brilliantly impatient. So remember, we had the test concerts in February of 1924. By November, she was not happy. And her way of dealing with this, and I'm sorry, I'm not letting David talk yet, but I'm having fun with the story.
It's a good story.
So by November, Mrs. Coolidge is about done with the glacial pace of the bureaucracy, which actually that would be really fast these days. And she decides to cut the check and move things along, which is a funny thing that some people do. And the library, unfortunately, could not cash that check at the time because the legal mechanism was not in place. However, this gave all of the people involved in the legislation the reason to move faster. So legislation was introduced in the end of 1924. In January, the first law was passed in both chambers and signed into law January 23rd of 1925, establishing accepting the gift to build the hall. And then shortly thereafter, the second piece of legislation, creating the Library of Congress Trust Fund Board, which administers endowments, was passed into law. Very important thing. Was Mrs. Coolidge related to President Coolidge? Raise your hand if it's a yes. Keep your hand down if it's a no. Yes. So I like to say no because it's beyond 6 degrees of separation, but our colleague Ray White corrected me that would not be acceptable. So 7 degrees removed as a cousin by marriage. A little loose. However, what was cool about this was that our Mrs. Coolidge actually would receive correspondence intended for the First Lady, and it came to the library. And we have this in the collection. It's super wild. And then the secretaries sent it back and forth, and it was all well. We think our Mrs. Coolidge was perhaps far more impactful, at least in the world of music, than the First Lady was. But we get to January of 1925, right? Yay, we're going to build a concert hall. Well, construction doesn't start until May of that year. And can anyone guess when the first concert was?
December?
Nope.
Close.
David's going to tell us. First concert.
October 28th, 1925.
Oh, you
So 5 months. Contracts, construction. There was no OSHA, I don't think, at that point in time, which we're dealing with now. However, it was remarkable. Within 5 months' time, we go from starting the project to getting it opened. There's an amazing story about the organ, which you're going to hear in a little bit from David, that gives you even more kind of color commentary on this timeline. But October 28th of 1925 was when the magic began, right next door. And we can all thank Mrs. Coolidge, Carl Engel, and Herbert Putnam, who went along with it, for creating this amazing space for us to gather to create music for the nation, really. which was the mandate. Mrs. Coolidge wanted these concerts to be free and open to the public. She wanted the finest artists touring to be able to come here, and she wanted to support both living composers and composers of the past with commissioning new works. And the deal was, if she commissions a piece, or the library commissions a piece, we get the manuscript for the collection. So we were going back to that original intent of Engel of receiving these composer manuscripts to build the collection. Now, we're going to turn me off, and I'm going to have you listen to the voice of Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge.
After 7 years in Pittsfield, my chamber music festivals had grown to such proportions and seemed to me so important that I decided to perpetuate them by placing them under institutional management. Still another chance suggestion then led me to consider the Library of Congress as the most desirable, impersonal, and permanent administrator of my cherished project. Dear Carl Engel and the librarian, Mr. Herbert Putnam, proved deeply sympathetic and enormously helpful in bringing this about, and I was not only very glad to share an increasingly heavy responsibility, but also welcomed the opportunity to establish in the government a little wedge of authority in matters of art. I think I was even kindly accused of a little wangling, and perhaps justly, for I could wish for music the same governmental protection that is given to hygiene, education, or public welfare. How wonderful if we could have in the cabinet a Secretary of Fine Arts. I feel that in the course of 26 years, my concerts have developed and guided my career as much as I have guided them. One idea has evolved another. One event has grown into another. I have followed their direction into paths at first entirely unforeseen, until today I find myself in your midst at this festival, feeling the radiation of friendship and beauty which chamber music broadcasts, as I feel the return messages, augmented 1,000-fold, which center in this little auditorium in the Library of Congress.
You have just heard a talk by Mrs. Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, creator of the foundation named for her in the Library of Congress, where the 10th Festival of Chamber Music is now in progress.
So, another view of Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge here in the center. On the left, Carl Engel, who was the chief of the music division at the time of the founding of the concerts. And on the right, Herbert Putnam, who was one of the most impactful librarians of Congress in history, who really transformed the institution into the modern mega library that we are today. And we are going to shift now. And just a word on how the book is organized. And I hope you all consider purchasing a book because it supports the library. And you'll get to dive into this much more. We'll tell you about how many tears were, it was a whole process. We kept getting told, write more, write more, write more. And then they cut about 75% of that, which was shocking.
Due to the quality of the writing, that's all I can presume.
But we had wonderful editors here in the library's publishing office. But it's organized kind of in this operatic theatrical format because we had so much we wanted to throw in. And there's some things that needed a focus differently than a chronological timeline. So we have kind of the prologue, preface kind of content to set the scene and tell the story of the origin of the concert series. And then we go into Act 1, which talks a lot about the composers and the performers. And then we get into Act 2 and we look at the ways that the concert series has expanded its reach over the years from the radio broadcasts up to COVID and virtual content, as well as looking at the expansion of our dance theater programming, as well as other popular song genres. And David is going to take us back to that very consequential night, which we're going to be reliving at least once more tonight.
Yeah. So this is kind of exciting. It was amazing to me that they had this figured out from the very beginning. Mrs. Coolidge had her angle, as it were, and they together they came up with this really brilliant way of creating an event, not just a concert that has piece, but something that would be a memorable event for the first thing that you'd hear in the space. And so there's this remarkable series of, I'll just give you a preview of this. You may have read a little bit about this in a blog that went up recently, but there's this remarkable series of letters that go between Carl Engel and Linwood Farnham, who was the first person to play in the Coolidge Auditorium. Farnham was an organist, and that's the kind of the moment where you should say, oh, do you guys have an organ? And in fact, we did until 1953. And it was a wonderful E.M. Skinner pipe organ, but it was a bit big for the space, so they decided at that time that they would not use it anymore, and it actually went to a church in Georgetown, where it remains until sometime, I don't know, we're not sure what's going to happen to it, but we're hoping good things for its future. But in any case, this organ was this. Engel was writing to Farnham on October 3rd, and the first concert's October 28th. And he's writing to him, and he says, we're going to have this organ. It's going to be shipped, pretty soon, and we're going to have it installed and ready to go on October 28th. And so Farnham was like, sure, yeah, I'm in. But so he just took him at his word, and somehow they managed to do this. They actually had this organ installed, a pipe organ, in the Coolidge Auditorium in that brief period of time. But one of the amazing things that comes out of this correspondence also is a discussion of the actual program that was being put together. So for the event, 2 works have been commissioned by Mrs. Coolidge. This is just for the first. There are actually other commissions, but for the first concert, there was a new commission by Charles Loeffler and also by Frederick Stock, who's also known as a conductor. And so the piece by Loeffler starts with this kind of low G sharp that's kind of isolated sounding before it comes in. And it has a very special sort of start to it. And Engel had this concern that if they started the program this way, that people would be coughing and shuffling and stuff, and they would lose that sort of ambiance that they were hoping to build up for this momentous occasion. So the idea was instead to have a chorale prelude by Bach played. Which one? He wasn't sure. Is there one in G sharp? No, is the answer to that. If you like G sharp major or minor, I don't believe either of those exist in that chorale prelude sets. So what they decided to do was to look for, he had one in mind. It was in G major, and asked Farnham to transpose it up to A flat, and then, which is the same thing as a G sharp, where they sound the same, at least with the key. Anyway. But then what happened was that they had this idea where they would play the chorale, and then they would start the Loeffler right out of it. And so we know that Farnham thought this was a great idea, and he wanted to go with it. And we know that they did it because it was reviewed. And the New York Times commented on it saying, wow, this was such an effective idea for how to start this concert. So one of the exciting things, it's always fun to there's so many of these stories. That didn't make it in the book, by the way. So, but it was, we also didn't know which chorale prelude it was. We had to look around and figure out, we were eventually able to find out which one after a long search. But this stuff is just not, it's all just to be found in the archives that we have at the library. I think that the point of that first concert, and it was actually a series of several days worth of concerts where they had the mixture of old and new. So they'd have the traditional classical chamber music, but then they'd have new music. They had commissioned a string quartet from Howard Hanson. They had English madrigal singers. They had all kinds of people. I mean, and just going right away, they tried to get the cream of the crop. Alfred Cortot came and played. You have Wanda Landowska came and played in 26, and so forth and so on. But the idea was that this idea of tradition and innovation was there from the beginning, and I think that sort of vision was somehow able to just kind of blossom here, and was really allowed the series to last as long as it has, and hopefully we'll continue to do that. That's I think something that we all hold dear who work at the concert office and the Library of Congress, is that we like to preserve things, but we also like to augment those collections with new things, new genres, new any other types of things that we can help to bring to the public in a new way. So that's a quick opening of that, look at that opening event.
Now, one thing I'll tell you, as you all know, because you're not newbies, we put out displays for each of our concerts, and tonight's display was done by Ray White, who's one of our dear senior music specialist colleagues. And in that display, among the amazing treasures about the building of the hall and the origin of the concert series, is the very canceled check that Mrs. Coolidge sent in to move the U.S. government along with her master plan, which is pretty cool. You can also see that in the book, but the real life check is out there tonight. So be sure to see that.
And Richard, were those the pricks hanging?
No. That was a model of one of the proposed renovations from the 90s. Yeah. Okay, we're gonna shift into the artist residencies conversation. This was a big reason why the library's concerts became famous, because there were amazing touring ensembles like the Juilliard String Quartet, the Budapest Quartet, Beaux-Arts Trio, who had a very significant musical home here over decades. Combine that with the fact that both Mrs. Coolidge and Mrs. Woodall were committed to our concerts being broadcast on the radio, and they provided the funding to make that happen. Mrs. Coolidge also mandated that the hall be wired for radio broadcast from when it was constructed. So this notion of, the role of a wonderful concert series in a national institution is great, but if you just have it accessible here in Washington, you're not actually really reaching the people at large. So what ended up happening as a result of these broadcasts that started off with being weekly broadcasts, and eventually the regular broadcast went through about the early 90s. And then since then, we've done special projects, including on Sirius XM radio. WETA had a series last fall, online radio featuring our commissions and such. It all goes back to that very beginning. But if you've heard of the Met Opera broadcasts, whether on the radio or in movie theaters, we were that for chamber music for 90 years, or just under 90 years, which is really important because it was one of the primary ways in which the American population came to hear of the Library of Congress. This is not an institution that everyone knows about, just because you might not have had reason to interact with it. We're definitely growing in our kind of presence in popular culture and in the mindset, but it was concert broadcasts from this very auditorium that helped this institution become known to everyone. And we really made chamber music part of the kind of sound of what it meant to turn on the radio in the United States, which is pretty wild. So Davey's going to take it away and tell you more about the artist residencies.
Sure. Yeah. So the instigator really for the artist residencies came with the gift in 1935 of Stradivari quintet of instruments that are held over there. They had been augmented by several Del Jesus, Guarneris, and an Amati, and another Stradivari viola you may have heard of that we acquired last year. And so these all came from Mrs. Woodall. So she was another one of we consider her a founding patron, even though it's 12 years after, or 10 years after that Mrs. Coolidge's, I think. They had a sort of rivalry. I would call it a friendly rivalry, but I'm not sure how friendly it was. But what was neat about it was that Mrs. Coolidge supported new music, did lots of commissions. That wasn't really Mrs. Woodall's thing, but she did purchase manuscripts that she would then give to the library or help to direct how her funds would be spent on those things. But in any case, with the acquisition of the Stradivari instruments, they needed to be played. And that was something that we had to work towards, the library had to work towards. And so in 1942, the Budapest Quartet was pretty much stuck in the US. It was not possible to do touring in Europe for obvious reasons. And so the Budapest Quartet became our first quartet in residence. And they stayed there for quite some time, and they played sometimes multiple concerts of the same repertoire, but they would play throughout this period of time. And one other just quick note about that first year, the one of the most important events that happened was the 1937 Stradivari memorial anniversary. It was some multiple of his death. I'm blanking on it right now. It's like 200 or something like that. I can't remember which one it was, but in any case, Mrs. Woodall joked about. Well, we'll probably hear what she says about it in just a moment. But one of the interesting things is that right where we're standing, there was a performance by Rudolf Serkin and Adolf Busch, who came in and kind of inaugurated this space that we're in right now. So Mrs. Woodall's piano used to be in here. The Stradivari instruments used to be in kind of these glass cubes, like that you could get really close to and potentially fall into. So I think that they decided that was a risk not worth continuing. So now they're much more safely stored. But so anyway, that was a wonderful thing. Eventually, the Juilliard Quartet took over. I always get the question of why did they why would they change quartets and things like that? Well, people get older. It's also, if you're doing the same thing all the time, that's not always the greatest for artistic growth. But it was wonderful for the instruments, and the Juilliard Quartet took over in 1960, and they were here for ages, another 40 years. And the Beaux-Arts Trio came in, I think, 1982 or 3, and then they were present here until 2008. What's kind of well, in different iterations. What's kind of amazing about the Beaux-Arts Trio is that they, Menahem Pressler, the pianist, had been playing at the library over a period of 50 years. And so we have recordings of him from when he was 50 years younger to when his final performance here, I think it was in 2008. In any case, these residencies help to kind of establish a baseline use of how the Stradivari sounds, because of course you need to have artists who are used to working with the instruments and have a good sense of how they how to make them sound good, because it's not just something you can just pick up and do. Nowadays, we don't have those residencies anymore. And so what we do is we have lots of different quartets come in, but we require them to come in a bit early so that they spend more time with the instruments. And this allows them to kind of get better set with them. So these are very exciting. Do we have Mrs. Woodall's?
We do. And while I'm, well, a couple things first. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a letter, which you can't read from afar, obviously, but it is actually a letter from Congressman John F. Kennedy requesting tickets to come hear the the Budapest String Quartet in concert. So this is a little flavor of like the stature of what we do in terms of Washington and cool historical figures. But this is something that we do with members of Congress. We really love it when they come over and they participate in this. It's hard with their schedules, especially if they're not DMV area representatives, but people are generally aware of what we do and are very supportive of what we do because they know that artists from their districts come in town, and they know that we, on a nonpartisan basis, really make sure that music is flourishing on behalf of the legislative branch of the United States government, which is unique from a lot of the other arts happenings in the federal government. This you can see is the Whitall Pavilion, and if you've never noticed the ironwork there, there's an homage to the Strads, which are across the way. And this is a photo of Mrs. Whitall. So for those of us who like melodrama, the two of them, Mrs. Coolidge and Mrs. Whitall, did not want to be near each other. So the apocryphal story, it goes that they basically they had seats far away from each other in the hall, and they were always there together. Mrs. Coolidge eventually moved, was based in Massachusetts more. She had been always, but so when she would come down for concerts and Mrs. Whitall would be there, very separate, they would orbit kind of away from each other, and we love them both dearly. But for those of you who were at the Strad concert in December, you have heard this already, but for those who were not, this is just an important opportunity to hear Mrs. Whitall tell you herself about what she wanted to have happen.
To all unseen friends who are listening in tonight, we welcome you. We are brought together by the universal bond of the love of music. This collection of instruments that you will hear played upon this week were made by the great craftsman Antonio Stradivarius. I held them in trust for a short time. Now they belong to every one of you, for they were given to our government to hold and protect forever. In presenting these instruments to the Library of Congress, it was my aim to give to the people of this country an opportunity to see and hear these rare Stradivari. They can be viewed at the Library of Congress by anyone who wishes to do so. They can be heard in concerts held in the library and also through the medium of the radio by an even larger audience. If the appreciation and enjoyment of music in America will be advanced thereby, the purpose of my gift will have been fulfilled. As you already know, the festival being held this week is to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the death of Stradivari on December 18th. But it is not our intention to make you wait another century or two for a similar presentation. It is our hope that we shall be able to present a commemorative concert each year on December 18th, and that arrangements will be made whereby you can all hear it.
And a very fabulous fact that I just heard about recently from our curator of musical instruments, Carolyn Ward Bamford, is that we have the largest collection of Stradivari instruments in the custody of a public institution in the United States, which is pretty awesome. And that's because of our most recent edition, the 1690 Stradivari Fulton X Baird Tuscan Medici viola, which is in the bottom right corner of the furthest case to the right there. A little taste of other instruments in the collections here. We have we have multiple Landowska instruments, but her Pleyel is pictured here. And then you can see the Buchla 100 synthesizer that belonged to Morton Subotnick in the upper right, whose papers we also have. It was commissioned by the concert series and so on and so forth. And then in the bottom right is a really cool thing. And this is the Oberlin Betz violin, which is a copy of the Betz Strad violin. And there was a wonderful project done over multiple years at Oberlin College. They have a summer instrument making workshop, and they literally brought together radiologists and luthiers and musicians and all kinds of interesting people that do like CT scans and stuff. And they studied the Betz violin for the sake of intending to replicate it as much as is possible in studying the wood, the varnish, the aging, that kind of thing. They ended up making a replica, and a wonderful gentleman named Dr. Sloan ended up purchasing that replica and donating it to the library. But for those of you who came like 13 years ago, we actually had a listening test comparing. Were you here? We were too. Pretty cool. You had the opportunity to hear two instruments and decide which one was the real Strad, and I can assure you most people didn't get it right, which is kind of great.
All
Kind of
bets
funny.
were off.
Yeah. Yes. Anyways, so it kind of goes to show that these collections are not just here to sit, right? They're here to be studied. They're here to be used in the way that they were intended to be used when they were created. And this is, I think, sets us apart quite a bit from other national libraries in particular, where we're really focused on maximizing access as much as is possible. And that means sometimes, we are getting the Strads out, and we even take the Strad viola that we just acquired out on the road. That's part of the mandate of the gift that we received, is that the funders wanted us to make sure that that instrument could reach people across the country, even beyond here in Washington. And we're going to shift to a very important story about a very important composer.
Sure. There are kind of two quick ones. One is that Mrs. Woodall, in addition to her gifts of the instruments, would also acquire manuscripts for us. And three important ones that happened in 1950 were from Arnold Schoenberg. So in particular for Claire de Nacht, which is Transfigured Night, which is pictured there on the left, just a small portion of it, not the whole thing, obviously. But that was one of the pieces. Pierrot Lunaire was another, and the Second String Quartet, which is kind of a seminal work of his as well, were purchased. But we also had interactions with composers about commissions and things like that. And so a good case in point is with Bela Bartok. There's a kind of half-hidden image of the finale of his Fifth String Quartet, which was commissioned by the Library of Congress. But in that letter that's there, he actually spoke. He was writing to Harold Spivak at the time, was the chief of the division, and was writing to him about the possibility of a sixth commission. Because he really needed to get out of Europe. And unfortunately, we didn't have the funding at the time to be able to do it, although we kind of wish they could have pulled that one together, but that's okay, man. I know how it gets difficult. But what came out of this was that this really heartfelt and ominous letter where he's talking about he doesn't know what's going to happen to his homeland, was Hungary, and whether or not he'd be able to receive his family again, so forth. And so he really just wanted to have a new opportunity for them and to get away from all the madness that was happening in Europe. And so he, what they worked out was to present a recital at the Library of Congress with Joseph Szigeti, who's Bartok's friend, the violinist, famous violinist, who had previously played at the library with Courtauld, I think. And then to have them do this, what's now a very extremely famous and legendary performance in 1940, that brought him over. And he was able to then stay here and eventually become a citizen. His family was able to come. And so he didn't have the greatest end-of-life story. He passed away in 1945, but it was still something that was like, it's heartwarming to think that the library played a small role in getting a composer like that over here. I should also mention that in addition to the Fifth String Quartet, the Library of Congress also has major works like the Concerto for Orchestra, which was a Kusevitsky commission. And like Nick was saying earlier, as a condition of commission, we asked for those manuscripts to be given to the library to be able to preserve and to present to researchers in the future.
And we're going to take a moment to talk about our jazz programming, which has evolved. And there was a gesture to jazz that happened in the early days that really can be seen as laying the groundwork for what we do now. But why present jazz? Well, it's one of the most important uniquely American originated art forms. But the vision of the series was from the very outset about the space and bringing quality music to the audience in the space. It wasn't necessarily saying it had to be classical music. It was, the classical music is the majority of the chamber music tradition, but at the end of the day, really, chamber is about the size of the room. And jazz has become part of that. If you look at the way Chamber Music America represents what chamber music is, jazz has a very important, prominent part in that as well. However, being the National Library, presenting a uniquely American art form just makes a lot of sense. And the way that this is expanded in our presenting has paralleled our collections growth in the way that we've expanded to collect jazz archives over the years. And we have everything from Max Roach's papers to Hazel Scott's papers to Charles Mingus's papers to Ella Fitzgerald's big band charts and many other amazing jazz collections that have come in over decades, many of which are thanks to the gentleman in the top center here, our dear late colleague, Larry Applebaum, who is a legend of many things and Grammy winner and all kinds of other things. But he really is the most important figure in the growth of the library's jazz holdings. And David will tell you a bit about the gentleman in the top left and then the rest of the slide.
Yeah, sure. We miss Larry deeply. Nathaniel Shilkret gave a concert in 1928 and with his band, and they played what we think is the first jazz tune by W.C. Handy, the St. Louis Blues. Is that right? Anybody?
Sounds right.
Sounds right. Yeah. We'll edit
I think I heard
that
that
for
in middle school.
Yeah. Boy, I just blew that one. But then we had that was then, and then a long time went before you'd have additional concerts, and some of those concerts were ones that where they'd have like fusion types of things with say string quartets, and sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. Especially, it just depends on who's playing. But we would then have, there's this amazing period in about 1999 and 2000, actually 1996 through 2000, we had a whole bunch of different projects that came to being. One of them is Cecil Taylor was commissioned, and he performed at the library. We did not actually have this picture. We had to find it from a gentleman who was at that concert, and he happened to take that picture. I'm assuming it was all on the up and up. But it was an amazing one. And he also gave us a picture that he took of Max Roach playing at the library, once with the Beijing Trio, and then another time just kind of him soloing. Max Roach came and he gave a talk as well. We have Chucho Valdez in the bottom, and this is a great photo. I think this is by my colleague Claudia Morales. Chucho is here, and he's holding a picture of him and Max Roach. And so it was one of those really great outreach moments that we like to do with any artist who comes here. We like to say, look, you can be represented here too. In fact, you are represented here in these different ways. And it kind of inspires them to start thinking about legacy and how to keep some of these things alive and held, because it's an important thing to preserve these things, in our opinion. And then, of course, we have Billy Strayhorn on the upper right. We have his collection, and it took 3 or 4 years before we could get it to happen because of the pandemic and stuff. But we eventually had a Strayhorn celebration that had a big band night, and a combo night, and it was a wonderful thing. And we had Strayhorn's biographer speaking about it, members of the family talking about his legacy. And so it's one of those wonderful things that we've been able to do more of over time. And I think maybe, Nick, you want to say something about our special funding for that?
And just before that, the featured vocalist when we had the big band for the Strayhorn Festival a couple years ago was someone named Akep Nkwele, who is appearing here next Thursday. So I encourage you to check her out. She's a rising star in the jazz world and a DC native, which we love always. Another thing on the jazz front, we just acquired the Gil Evans papers, and Gil Evans was was Miles Davis's very important arranger and responsible for Sketches of Spain and so on and so forth. So we give kudos to our colleague Vin, who's in the back here, and his team for doing that work of bringing in these amazing collections that help us tell a deeper story. And it's the Miles Davis Centennial, so why not get the manuscripts from some of his most important work? And yes, so our jazz has exploded in the last 11 years, thanks to the generosity of the Logan family and the Ravada Foundation and various family foundations that they've had over the years. Dan Logan had been coming to our concerts for decades, like many of you. He literally cold called, and back when I was the guy that answered the phone along with David, Dan was like, let's talk about doing some jazz programs. Like, sure. And then Anne figured it out, and we were able to start to work with Dan on regular jazz programming that is supported by his family foundation. And the way that we do this programming is really special. We bring in the great masters of jazz from ever, right? Stanley Clark is coming in a few weeks, for example. We bring in the rising stars who we have relationships with based on other things and papers. So Ekep Nkwele, we just had Yilian Cangisares, we just had Christian McBride, which is amazing. We're trying to give a glimpse at different elements of the way that jazz is evolving. But we also have a really special thing called the Library of Congress Jazz Scholar, which is a part of the support that we get from the Ravada Foundation to bring in someone who is a leading thinker, writer, speaker, practitioner in the jazz world to come and spend time in the collections and discover whatever it is that they want to discover, which is pretty darn awesome. And we've had amazing people in the jazz world, some of whom have passed away, like Dan Morgenstern, come and work in the collection and help tell the story of what's here that we depend on the researchers to do, because we can do some of that work, but it's really our purpose to make sure that stuff is accessible for people to come and do that kind of discovery. Okay. We're running out of time, so we're going to speed on through. On the left side here, you can see one of the early lists of concerts that were going to be broadcast on the radio. On the top was going to be on Columbia Radio, and then on the bottom, NBC Radio, catching up to the COVID era where we had Conrad Tao playing Rhapsody in Blue with set to tap dance, or tap dance set to the Rhapsody in Blue performance virtually. Now, as we're approaching the end, the Friends of Music in the Library of Congress, which many of you are a part of. We are greatly appreciative for that support. As you can see on the left side here, this is probably too hard to read, but in the old days, it was a very important thing to be a friend of music in the Library of Congress. It still is that, but we don't make you brag about it quite as much as in the old days. Well, cheeky Mrs. Coolidge and the folks here at the library would go to people, the major figures in the music business, say, hey, you need to be a part of this, whether they were going to be coming to the concerts or not. So on the left side here is Serge Kusevitsky's membership card as a non-resident member of the Friends of Music from 1931, which is really special because we now, as some of you know, have the Serge Kusevitsky Archive as well as the Kusevitsky Music Foundation, which is the main commissioning endowment that we have that supports commissions outside of the library. For the concert series, we commission works that we want to have performed here, but the Kusevitsky commissions tend to be larger scale works like for orchestra, but we get the manuscript still. So that's why we have the Copland Third Symphony manuscript. That's why we have Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes opera manuscript, which every British person I tell that to says, why do you have that and not us? Well, who paid for it? Kind of how that goes sometimes. But anyways, just to give a glimpse of how significant this thing is that we're all a part of, including you, most importantly you. The original president of the Friends of Music is pictured in this photo on the right. He is the gentleman third from the left. Can anyone tell me who that is? Whether by sight or by knowing who it is. He's rather bald, rather dapper. Speaker of the House, Nicholas Longworth, was the first president of the Friends of Music in the Library of Congress, which is pretty darn cool. And this is a picture with Engel and I believe it's Putnam and the board of the Friends of Music when this photo was taken, handing over manuscripts that they purchased for the library's collection, which is one of the things that the Friends have done over the years. And then in the bottom center, there's a little tiny photo of a young whippersnapper playing the violin, and that is in fact the same stately bald gentleman when he was about 9 years old. Nicholas Longworth was a musician. There's some really, really funny press coverage of apparently he would just like be at an event and start singing and roasting people in song, which is kind of wild. But he himself owned a Strad violin, which did not come to us. We're still bitter. But this kind of really does point to the fact that this is a really big deal, that we all get to be a part of an experience. And for a sitting Speaker of the House to want to give of their time and their service in this way says a lot, we think, about what we get to witness. Just a moment here to plug one of the composers whose papers we have, Irving Fine. He was a contemporary of Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland. He founded the School of Creative Arts at Brandeis. The Fine family, well, first off, Fine was an amazing composer and music educator. He died tragically young, in his late 40s, I believe. And he was a recipient of 2 Library of Congress commissions, a Coolidge Commission and a Kusevitsky Commission. The Kusevitsky was for the string quartet, and the Coolidge Commission was for the romanza, for wind quintet, which is one of the 2 most amazing American wind quintets of the 20th century. But his family created an endowment here along with giving us their Irving's papers, and the Fine Endowment helped support this book project, so we really appreciate what they've done for the library over the years. And we're now on our, I think we said, 4th generation of Fine family folks coming and supporting what we do. We had the littlest great-grandsons of the composer here a few months ago, which is pretty cute. And we're not going to go too far into it because we think you probably all know about this since you're regulars here, but our most important flashy moment in the history of our concert series was in what year? Oh, someone said it. 1944. So imagine, it's Washington. It's still World War II. We're past D-Day, which is better. But something remarkable happened in American music and art. And it was dance, it was music, it was design. It was a moment in the zeitgeist that really elevated what we do, but also gave, I think, the world a taste of the American spirit and that hope and that optimism that we were kind of putting out into the world at that time of strife. And the library commissioned Martha Graham to create a ballet. And Aaron Copland was brought on board to do the music. And Ballet for Martha was born. It was not Appalachian Spring until later on when Martha Graham decided that a line from a Hart Crane poem worked for the piece and the music that Aaron Copland had composed. So the Graham Company came and presented the world premiere for Mrs. Coolidge's 80th birthday, October 30th, 1944. And it was for that birthday that a citation was created for her, and the top signature was President Roosevelt. And that is where the title of the book comes from, because it says, as I'll read to you maybe in a second if I get to it quickly. Drum roll.
There's so much great information there.
Yes, there is.
The only way you can really find the end of this story is by...
Oh. Well, anyways, I'll find it. I'll bring it back. But amazing moment in music history. To think that this quintessential American work was birthed in this moment in the National Library and is a part of all of our lives musically, whether we like it or not. If you are a musician, everyone encounters this piece, if only because the press geek conductors need to practice, and this piece comes up. The best trivia fact to know about this is only 13. There's only 13 instruments in the original orchestration because of the size of our orchestra pit. And if you can go on YouTube and see a video of the original production, and it's in a larger space than on our stage in the video that's on YouTube. But it's a really remarkable thing. The original instrumentation of Appalachian Spring was 13 instruments.
What is
Our orchestra pit.
Yeah.
We have an orchestra pit. Yes. That's how this happened. Yeah. Anyways, come see the orchestra pit next time we have ballet. But in 2016, we invited the Graham Company back and commissioned a new dance work. But this is a photo of the remounting of Appalachian Spring here in 2016, which is pretty cool. And another image here, and an image of the new work that we had commissioned called Woodland by choreographer Pontus Lidberg. This is just a nice thing to throw in. So one of the things that happens over the course of the history of the concert series is that many new folks come into the fold in terms of wanting to create their stamp and legacy in the terms of the concert series. The bandmaster of the President's Own during the Civil War was named, not Sousa, Francis Maria Scala. He was Italian-American and he was a clarinetist. This is a photo of him on the right side.
He was also a scholar, wasn't he?
so?
David. Anyways, there's more of that in your program notes for tonight. Oh, actually, no, because David didn't write them, sadly. Right? Anyways, David's our resident punster, if you haven't figured that out. But if anyone wants to hear the puns that were cut from the book, David's still reminding us of how he feels about that. Anyways, Scala's family set up an endowment to support the performance of works by Scala as well as other works from the band world, which is really lovely. And one of the most amazing treasures we have in our collection, which shows how the arts tie into major moments in U.S. history. I'm going to read this to you. Will the leader of the Marine Band please call and see Mrs. L today, February 4th, 1862, A. Lincoln. That is held by the music division because, guess what? The bandmaster needed to talk to the First Lady to plan the tunes for the party that night in the White House. Meanwhile, they had their sick kid upstairs, and we're dealing with that, which is pretty wild. So we have these amazing treasures that people would never realize would be in a music library's collection, whether it's Jackie Kennedy writing to Leonard Bernstein at 4 a.m. the night of RFK's funeral mass, pouring her heart out like you have never seen from anyone. It's really remarkable. But we are running out of time. Examples here of what we do for musical theater. And this is, once you've lived with this concert series for quite some time, and we're not as tenured as Anne is, who's been stewarding this for many years now. But we've been a part of moments that are now kind of unfathomably of the past. So on the top left was a concert we did in 2013, The Musical Worlds of Victor Herbert, whose papers we have. He wrote Babes in Toyland, was one of the founders of the American Society for Composers, Authors, and Publishers. And on the stage there performing are Rebecca Luker and Aaron Lazar, who were two amazing Broadway performers who tragically passed really, really young in recent years. Something happened to him. Okay, yeah. Excuse me. Thank you. Yeah, Rebecca Luker did pass away. Thank you. Appreciate it. And then on the right side are photos of Shoshana Bean, who has performed here. She was, of course, just in Hell's Kitchen on Broadway and also in Wicked earlier on. Janine Tesori in the center on the right side, amazing Broadway composer and also doing opera as well, whose papers are here at the library now performing. And Audra McDonald in the bottom right, who is amazing for so many different reasons, but she gave a wonderful concert that was impacted by the 2013 shutdown of the federal government and came back around in February 2014, I think is what happened, something like that. But anyways, amazing artists who have come through these halls. Of course, we also are involved in the library's Gershwin Prize for Popular Song, which has recognized amazing songwriters and performers of American popular song, ranging from Stevie Wonder, who also received a McKim Commission, ask us how Anne made that one happen, up to Joni Mitchell, and most recently Sir Elton John and Bernie Taupin. And in closing, because we're way over time, we are grateful for all of you, because this doesn't work except for your participation. And this is why we exist. We are here to make this content and these collections come alive for you. But I'm going to invite David to give us a little explanation of why the image on the left is on the screen and in the book. And then I'm going to pull something up to read for you at the very end.
Sure. So the library acquired the papers of George Crumb a few years ago. George Crumb was an amazing American composer who also was just an amazing with his handwriting was impeccable. And so he would draw figures in his scores. And this one is a picture of an eyeball called The Realm of Morpheus, Morpheus being a god of sleep, not from the Matrix. Although, who knows? We don't know exactly what his inspiration was. But he would draw these things in such a way that the piano 1 would be playing, so the top part, and then piano 2 would be playing the internal one. And he actually had a cheat sheet for the musicians at the end where they could read it out, lay it out, so they didn't have to invert their heads while reading it. But the idea was that there's something like this is like poetry over time that's in the shape of a heart or things like that. There's something to be said about the image of music on the page, and it has a way of kind of coming to life and looking forwards and backwards. And that's he's one of those great examples of I would call him a traditional great American composer who is also incredibly innovative. And sometimes it's just in a subtle way like this with an eyeball looking at you. So we like the image. So
there you go. So before I give you our last little delight here, A few housekeeping things. We will be available to sign books if you would like to get your book signed. If you have not purchased your book but would like to do so at a discount that doesn't involve an online conglomerate, the library's shop has made the books available at a discount, and they're out at the information desk just outside of the Whitall door. And please be sure to check out the lobby display. It's really a remarkable way to connect with all of this history. And in the concert tonight, just for those that might not have realized this, this was postponed due to the shutdown in October. It was originally going to be the Founders Day concert, marking 100 years to the weekend, basically, or to the week of the first concerts in 1925. And it's really just a remarkable honor for all of us to be a part of this in our small ways. And we're grateful to all of you for your support and believing in this work. And this is the tip of the iceberg of the stories. We discovered so many new stories in this work. We had colleagues confirm what the Bach chorale was that was performed on the first concert because of this book project. Wonderful colleagues contributed episodes throughout, some of whom you know who work here at the concert. So we really encourage you to check out the book or check it out from your library. That is great too. Make your library buy it. And if their budget is constrained, let us know. We can send them a copy. So no excuses on that for your library. But this was the citation presented to Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, signed by the President of the United States, along with a lot of other cool people. To Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge on her 80th birthday, October 30, 1944. The Library of Congress presents this volume to Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge on her 80th birthday as a token of gratitude and esteem. The Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge Foundation, which she established, has made the Library of Congress preeminent in chamber music. It has sponsored the creation of chamber music by some of the greatest of living composers. It has given chamber music to all parts of the Republic. It has served as a model for other foundations in other fields. For this enrichment of the services which the Library of Congress is able to tender to the people of the United States, the library is profoundly grateful. Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge has done what none before her had found the means to do. She has given the music on the shelves of the library a living voice and let the people hear it. Thank you. Good job.